Hello and welcome back to World 360. French President Emmanuel Macron's outreach to China lands him in hot water. But is all the criticism against him valid? How has Israel and its closest ally, the US, grown further apart? And lastly, Australia will hold the biggest referendum in 24 years of its existence. But will it come at a political cost? We'll cover all this and more in today's episode. So first up, Macron. The French president has made quite a splash with his recent visit to China, and lest we forget, European Council President Ursula von der Leyen was also a part of the trip, but didn't receive as much criticism as he did. Why is that? Macron was arguably more vocal than von der Leyen on the need to include China in the Ukraine peace process, and the number of photo ops seemed to irk many in Washington. But it was also his choice words in an interview with Politico where he talked about resisting the need to become America's followers. Let's unpack this first. Since the Ukraine war began, the US and Europe have strongly aligned with one another, be it sanctions against Russia or depriving it of oil revenue. But unlike Europe, America isn't as oil dependent on Russia, enjoys a comfortable distance from the European continent, and its arms industry continues to profit from the war. Europe, meanwhile, is dealing with a major energy crisis, and its physical proximity to the war doesn't make it easier. It's been over a year since the war began, and peace between Ukraine and Russia is no longer just a nice thought for Europe, but a necessity as it looks down the barrel of a recession. Keeping this in mind, could Macron's visit to China be seen as a genuine attempt to reach out to a Russian ally, find a solution to a war, and resist any form of a Cold War? It's an intriguing thought. But some experts like Ian Bremmer argue that while it is natural for Macron to have concerns about US leadership, he should have raised them directly with the US or its allies instead of on a trip to China. China is, after all, the US's main strategic rival. Also, the difference between Macron and Ursula von der Leyen during the China visit is very interesting. Fast forward to today, Ursula von der Leyen played bad cop in China, while Macron played good cop. While Macron was received with pomp and personally welcomed by the Chinese foreign minister, Ursula von der Leyen got a somber reception. After talks with Xi Jinping, von der Leyen told the press in Beijing that she was counting on China to not provide Russia with any military equipment directly or indirectly. So to wrap up, were Macron and von der Leyen playing to the good cop, bad cop strategy, or was China seeking to exploit potential cracks in Europe's alliances? It could have been a little bit of both. But one thing's for sure, the US didn't like this visit by Macron one bit. It wasn't just American political commentators, but lawmakers too, who were irked by Macron's behavior in China, especially when he said Europe must distance itself from the Taiwan issue. US Senator Marco Rubio went as far as to ask if Macron even speaks for Europe. Now let's look at the growing rift between the US and its ally in the Middle East, Israel. Ever since Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came back to power last November, he's had a tough time. His coalition partners are mainly ultra-nationalists who have hardline views not just on Palestine, but on how Israel itself should be governed. When Netanyahu's government floated judicial reforms in January this year, it prompted angry protests and brought the democratic foundations of Israel into question. Netanyahu eventually backtracked on these judicial reforms after coming under extreme pressure from the Israeli public and trade unions. So how has Israel's domestic turmoil hurt its relationship with the US, a country from which it receives close to $4 billion in military aid every year? For this, we need to rewind to an exchange of words between the leaders of both countries. Now, last month, when protests in Israel were raging, US President Joe Biden publicly criticized Netanyahu over the proposed judicial reforms. The clincher was when he said Netanyahu will not be invited to the White House in the near term. Netanyahu was quick to shoot back, indirectly accusing Biden of interfering in Israel's internal affairs. He said his government won't bow to pressures from abroad, including from the best of friends. After the exchange of words, the US State Department spokesperson released a statement saying US commitment to Israel is ironclad and steadfast, and that sometimes the best of friends can disagree. But it isn't just this issue. There has been criticism from within Israel that the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu has been weak, and this weakness created a vacuum in which regional foes Saudi Arabia and Iran have now sought to repair relations. Yair Lapid, Israel's former prime minister, also weighed in on the turbulent Israel-US ties of late. To add to this, Netanyahu is yet to visit Washington since his swearing in December, which is a rare absence for a newly elected Israeli leader. Also, Jewish lobby groups in the US, such as the AIPAC, have been critical of Netanyahu's coalition government with far-right politicians. US Democrats themselves have turned skeptical of the new government in Israel. So in short, the US and Israel are definitely in a diplomatic mess, but is it something they can overcome? Yes, quite possibly. For our last topic, we're traveling to the other end of the globe, to Australia, which is going through a historical reckoning. In the second half of this year, Australians will have to vote on a referendum on whether the nation's Indigenous peoples should be recognized in the Constitution. Indigenous people refer to Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia who are descendants of those who inhabited the nation when Britain began colonizing the island in the 1700s. Now, if the referendum is in favor of Indigenous people, a process to alter the Australian Constitution will begin and an Indigenous advisory group to Parliament will be set up. But if we look at the history of referendums in Australia, it's not all that positive. Only 8 out of 44 have ever been approved. It's also tricky because even left-leaning parties in Australia are unsure whether they will support the referendum or not, and some aren't all that supportive of setting up an Indigenous advisory group to Parliament. This referendum is also going to be a reflection on Anthony Albanese and his leadership. Will he be seen as a man dividing the country or uniting it? We've seen how referendums have divided countries and ruined political careers in the past, like when former UK PM David Cameron brought forth the Brexit vote. Certain opposition parties in Australia are already pessimistic about this referendum, with some arguing that the vote could tear the country apart. But it may be too quick to jump to conclusions. The text of the referendum is yet to be drawn up and a date is yet to be set, which is why the next couple of months will be key for Australia and whether it can right the wrongs of its past without jeopardizing its present. Thank you so much for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.